I think as a historian too, like I understand how much has been done in the name of God, how many evil things have been done in the name of God, not because of any person's individual internal faith, but because of how it's been used by mankind, how it's been used by political structures to convince the masses that this is the right thing to do. I have a background in Middle Eastern studies, so the Abrahamic religions, all three of them, and others, because that's not all that's there. But I haven't encountered a single religion that at its core is hateful or promotes violence. It's how people use it to justify what they do that becomes the problem. Now, we can debate whose religion is right all we want to, but at their core, there's not a single one that I have found yet. They all promote love of your fellow human.
We're listening to The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and this is part 2 of our episode with historian Rachel Whitaker from the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History. In part 1, Rachel walked us through the arrival of faith in Northwest Arkansas, the circuit riders, the early church meeting minutes that functioned as social law, the denominations fracturing over slavery, and the founding of black churches. In part 2 of this episode, the conversation moves into even harder territory. Rachel takes us into the 20th century, where the KKK integrated itself deeply into church culture across Northwest Arkansas. She reads from newspaper ads where the Klan pledged consecrated devotion to the churches. She describes ministers who preached the virtues of Christ and then invited their congregations to Klan picnics. She tells the story of a white man in Harrison who was lynched by Klan members, not for race, but for failing to conform. And she names the mechanisms, the same charges the 1830 churches used to expel people from their fellowship, the Klan enforced with violence. But Rachel also brings the other side, and she tells the story of a black college student in the 1950s whose congregation voted to welcome her in despite the objection of some of their members. She names the courage of women of black churches who sheltered civil rights workers and even more. And then Rachel unpacks something that has stayed with me. From her historical and human point of view, from the Crusades to present, she talks about the relationship between faith and power. All right, this is part 2. Let's get into it. I am curious, you mentioned ideology. Is there a way to characterize maybe what that ideology was at that time of this deep fracture?
I think so many people got hung up. I don't know that you can say that it's any one ideology, though. That's the thing, is there's so many different factors in the Civil War and even in Reconstruction after, because there's a lot of violence that occurs after that, because you have the Jim Crow laws, you have all these different things. There's so many factors. But yes, there's always that dehumanizing or that othering, not necessarily dehumanizing, but at least othering of the other side of it, where I don't know, it's almost like you lose your empathy and you can't try to at least see it from the other side. I think we do this sometimes as historians with Nazi Germany. We just want to make them all bad guys. And honestly, they're humans like the rest of us. They make hard decisions, sometimes bad decisions, but like, how did they come to that? That's where I think historians are constantly trying to understand, why did you make this decision? Why did you do this? And I think that's why in the Civil War, I don't think there's that one answer, because I think so many historians have said it's a religious thing, or it's a political thing, or it's a economic thing, or there's so many factors. And sometimes it's just because all your neighbors were, it's peer pressure and you don't want to be outside that group. So I think that might be another part of it too, is just that collective identity.
That resonates a lot, Rachel, when you brought in groupthink and collectivism. And then really, I think I find the historical analysis of people who don't do that, don't join the groupthink. That I feel like history, there's so much to learn there. Because
why didn't they? Yeah.
Because I'm always questioning for myself, like, what would I have done during Nazi Germany? What would I have done? And the statistics tell me I would have done a lot.
Most people did. And even Nazi Germany starts out as a Christian movement. It's a Christian nationalist movement. I think 95% of Germans at the time were Christian, like one denomination or another. And they used their Christian beliefs to justify a lot of what happened during and after. And that's so hard for me. But I also know that given that moment, like if I were put in that position, would I or would I not say yes or no? Would I fall into that? And I would like to think I would say no, because there's a lot of things I'm saying no to right now. But that's because there's usually a face that I have in mind when I think of that other that everybody else is turning against. I have those friends. I have those. Sometimes it's me. Sometimes it's not even the friends. Sometimes it's me that I'm like, oh my gosh, like I would be part of that. But I don't know. Gosh, I don't know in Nazi Germany. And I would like to think that I would stand up, but I don't know.
One of our earlier episodes, Mike, I had so many tension conversations around what is faith, what is ideology,
right? Yes.
What is politics, and what is nationalism. And for me, and I will always speak for me, these are all internal, sacred faith questions.
Yeah.
What do I believe? What is God inside me? Is God leading me to believe, to love, to care? And then as soon as it becomes external, that feels open to interpretation. It feels
exactly.
Like it can be collectively moved. But I feel like I'm more and more sitting in quietness and stillness and just say, find your faith.
Yes. Yeah. The faith is important to me in a lot of ways. But I think as a historian too, like I understand how much has been done in the name of God, how many evil things have been done in the name of God, not because of any person's individual internal faith, but because of how it's been used by men. And I say that like in mankind, I'm not picking on men, but how it's been used by men, how it's been used by political structures to convince the masses that this is the right thing to do. And I have a background in Middle Eastern studies, so the Abrahamic religions, all three of them, and others, because that's not all that's there. But I haven't encountered a single religion that at its core is hateful or promotes violence. It's how people use it to justify what they do that becomes the problem. Now, we can debate whose religion is right all we want to, but at their core, there's not a single one that I have found yet. And there could be one. Like somebody might surprise me, but at their core, none of them are violent or hateful. They all promote love of your fellow human, and probably some version of what we have in Christianity, or at least in Protestantism, the love your neighbor and love God. Like those, that's the new covenant. Everything else goes out the window. Islam has that. Like there's one God. And then everything else that's in the Quran, in the surahs, the hadiths, all of that is about how you love God and how you love your neighbor. Judaism's the same thing. It's just how people take it and do something with it.
And it reminds me of something you brought up earlier. It's when it is utilized and used as a system of power, then for me, it feels like it's moved so far away from faith.
Maybe a question around this time too. I think it's easy, obviously, to focus on the parts of our history, and we should. We need to make sure we're absolutely doing that, where there is conflict and maybe where the church was on the wrong side of things.
Sure.
But I'm curious, from our record here in Northwest Arkansas, do we have stories or examples of when the church, like, it was on the right side? We talked about the Methodist Episcopal South, but there was a Methodist Episcopal North.
Yeah,
and
very many, but there were.
I'm curious what you find in our record about that story.
Sure. So definitely in the Black churches, the women. God, the women. We need to celebrate the women in church, especially in the Black churches. They are the glue that hold those communities together. They ostracize men if they voted against their best interests, but they also are the ones who invited the civil rights workers into their own homes. They fed them, they sheltered them when they came here during the civil rights movement. And we did have that even in Northwest Arkansas. We normally think about that more in like Mississippi burning kind of terms, but here we had groups that came, and it was those ladies in the churches, especially the Black churches, who were doing that. In Fayetteville, there was a Christian church. It's Fayetteville First Christian, and they had a rule that, and this is in the 1950s, that if you were a member of another Christian church somewhere else and you were going to college at the University of Arkansas, then you could come in through letter and join their congregation while you were there. And it wasn't you giving up your membership elsewhere, but you were welcome to take part in all parts of that congregation through a letter saying that you were a member someplace else. So the minister welcomed a young girl who was a college student into the congregation. There was also a rule that said that if the minister allowed somebody into the congregation under these rules, then they could object, and they would have to hold a vote on whether or not this girl could join the congregation. And 39 people signed a petition to block this girl from joining the church because she was Black. The minister was like, fine, we're going to vote on it. I trust my congregation. They overwhelmingly voted against those 39 people, and they welcomed that girl into the church. Her sister was one of the Little Rock Nine at Central High School. So we have that moment where we have the petition, we have the names. I'm not going to name names because some of these people are still around because this was the 50s. But we have that moment where the rest of the congregation just overwhelmingly said, no, she's a child of God. She belongs in our congregation. And they let her into the fold. And I think that's important. They also, First Christian Church in Fayetteville also hosted some Vietnam refugees so that they could go to school, they could stay together as siblings. And I think that there are a lot of good churches in the area, but I think it is easier. We like the gossip. We like those awful stories because we want a clear villain, and sometimes it's a lot more complicated than that. But yes, there are good examples in Northwest Arkansas of what a church should look like. And Bayari is a Muslim man. He's a businessman here in Northwest Arkansas. He built the synagogue. Like, how often do we talk about Muslim and Judaism, like, in a good way together? So yeah, I think there's good here in Northwest Arkansas.
I was just going to share, like, personally, Rachel, we moved to Northwest Arkansas 12 years ago, and I grew up in London. I'd never been in a community that is like, I've never been in a place that feels so like churches and the Christian faith foundational in it.
Yes.
'Cause before that, I lived in San Francisco. And I remember being really nervous and worried that we would not fit in as people who were brown, as people who, for myself, I wasn't from the country, so I wasn't American. And I was really concerned for my son, who's 4, and just the experience that he would grow up in. And almost the majority of our friends and the people that welcomed us and built and helped us build foundations of community in Northwest Arkansas were Christian and all Christian. And my experience as someone coming in, I think it's really important for me to share that, like, I had my own biases when I walked in and my own assumptions about what a Christian, sort of foundational Christian community might look like, how a lot of churches and people are committed to Sunday service, sometimes Wednesday services, sometimes more than that. And yeah, I'm not the same person as I was 12 years ago in a really good, deep way because of the community, a largely Christian community that I have connected with and grown to love and call friend. So I think that there's also the quiet social infrastructure of Christianity in the church. There is the hospitals and there is the schools, and we see that, but there's also just neighbor part, yes. The neighbor part of it, the infrastructure that's built, that's social and connected, and that really and truly integrates the sense of belonging and love and care. And I want to uplift that because that has been my personal experience. I know I can speak to that.
I think also it's the individual people. And I think that's where I'm at on my walk on this, is there are really good individual people, even whenever there are some really bad things going on in the name of God or in the name of whatever church denomination. There are really good people still there who want to do the right thing, who really do care about other people. And I think that's the part that has given me hope and has kept me holding on as long as it has, is the individuals.
Yeah. And that is not to say that I have not experienced incredibly hard experiences. And that is also true. And the two can both be true. And I think that as a community, as people, and I feel as a country, we find it really hard to hold an and perspective.
Right.
Two things can be true that we can, and there can be tension there, and we can sit with that and grapple with that. And I feel like one of the things that historians like you help us do is make sense of that tension. And I love when you bring into the room, we could have taken a different pathway.
You guys really want to get to like current day. One of the periods in our history, early 1900s, 1920s, we moved to this Jim Crow era. And I think one of the things that has been hard for me to understand is that sometimes I feel like the history is, when we talk about the Klan, the KKK, there seems to be, and this is totally my impression, right, which is why I'm coming to you for what the record looks like, is that there's this idea that, well, it was a social organization and it wasn't that bad and everybody was a part of it. And it wasn't until, later that it got really problematic. And everybody that influenced it in that society, they'd already left at that point. That feels like a prevailing narrative. I don't know if that's true or not. So I come to you and ask, like, when you look at the history of Northwest Arkansas and the integration of organizations like that, which still exists in our state today and are active, I'm curious, when you look through the long view of history here, maybe back to the origin, maybe give us a place to start with of what the reality of these organizations were, and if you can come all the way as far forward as you want today.
So the Klan, the original Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest Klan, the federal government says this is illegal. This is a bad thing. It's not a matter of freedom of speech. This is a hate group. They shut it down. It doesn't have a very long history. It goes underground. They name themselves some other things. It doesn't disappear. Let's be honest. It's still there. But the 1920s, you have this rise of what we call the second coming of the KKK, to add that like Christian narrative and vocabulary to it. But it actually starts out as a northern movement and not a southern movement. We generally think of it as a southern movement. And they market themselves as like a benevolent society, like the Masons or the Odd Fellows, or it's just another secret society that everybody wants to belong to. But they would go to the city governments and say, we want to start a Klan here. Do you guys want us to help you with like law and order? Fayetteville says, no, we're good. We don't need you. They go ahead and they form one, and they have 100 people within the first few months. So, they're hosting barbecues and parades, usually around 4th of July or Decorations Day, what we now call Memorial Day. So when we think of those celebrations, even like the KKK is a part of those kinds of big things. They built parks at Lincoln and in Rogers. The one at Lincoln was specifically set aside as a Klan like timeshare. It's $5 a year for your membership. This is new information not a whole lot of people know about. I just come across it not too long ago. But then you start listening to the rhetoric that they're using. And so they're using the Bible. Like, they're quoting scripture a lot of the times out of context, like anybody can do, but they're using scripture. But who's going to argue with that if you're going to be using scripture to justify what you're doing? Who's going to argue with the Bible, like in a Christian community? They promote 100% Americanism, whatever that means. They're really consumed with the loosening moral fabric of society. So they want women in the home raising babies, and they want men being men, and they're prohibitionists. They want women to be modest. They're anti-pornography and anti-smut. they're ultra nationalists. So nationalism is like at its core, it's just a pride in your own national identity, right? But ultra nationalism is this much bigger thing where your country is the best country in the world. And that's not just because that's what you're familiar with and you love your country. It's because nobody else can compete with this. So they get to they publish in the Fayetteville Daily Democrat, "To our churches, of which we are members, we pledge a deeper loyalty and a more consecrated devotion, assuring our ministers that this organization, founded it is upon the Christian religion and pledged in service to Christ, stands as your co-worker in all you seek to do." The Klan publishes this in the newspaper and sends it out to the churches in the area. They're a Christian organization. That's how they're promoting themselves. They're opposed to birth control. They think birth control is horrible until we get into the eugenics movement and they realize, oh, we can make sure other people are not having babies because we want to outbreed those groups. The ladies in the community, that like the young ladies that their dads were a member of the KKK, they would have these luncheons and these picnics that they would host, and they'd have all the single ladies, and then they would bring in all the young men in the KKK, and it's a husband hunting picnic. This is how they're going about this. So you have them doing all of these things that look very Christian, look very on the surface. They have in 1924 at Alpena, at the group meeting, they have this minister, Bradley, who comes in and is their main speaker for the night. So the church is involved in this. They showed up at Sulphur Springs. I don't know if I wrote down the date, but showed up at Sulphur Springs. 7 men, full regalia, hoods, everything. They show up to this church. It's a Methodist church. They walk in as a parade, singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, come in, make a donation and a speech to the minister, tell him that we're here to support you, walk back out. And this was happening all the time. So on the surface, they look like they fit with everything else that everybody else in society wants. It's a good Christian organization. They want this morality. They quote scripture, but they're anti-Semites because they don't think that Jews have a home, so they can't be trusted. Catholics aren't Christians because they owe their loyalty to a pope and not to Jesus Christ. They don't like black people. That ultra-nationalism is a problem too because it's anti-immigrant. It promotes xenophobia. And this is all really horrible because it's also being promoted as a Christian organization, and it's entering into that rhetoric in the churches. It's entering into that decision, who is moral and who is not moral, and how do they fit into this organization or this. Their propaganda that they're using rewrites history. They're erasing all the things slavery wasn't that bad. There's some horrible things. So they're very ingrained in our communities. They're very ingrained in our churches. They even told citizens you might have to give up some of your rights just to make the country safer. These things linger for a while.
I think my response is just holy but I can't probably publish that.
Yeah. Well, and they were also at Christmas, some of the communities would have these baskets that were filled with the meals for the poor families that couldn't afford the meat or whatever. And this one year I think they had 80 of them that they couldn't, the organization, the Christian Aid Society or whatever that was supposed to be doing it, they couldn't get the funding for all those. And the KKK in that community came in and wrote a check and said, here, so everybody can have a Christmas this year. And so again, I think we're back to that tension between there are good things, but there are also really bad things. And people have a hard time with going, yes, they're doing some really good things, but at the same time, what do they really stand for? And these are my neighbors. These are my family members. They're really good men, but they have some really horrible things that they stand for.
Rachel, can I ask you, going a little bit back to the power conversation and linking it here, can you share a little bit about how the Klan then helps reinforce that church power and hierarchy, and specifically the people that are holding the power in the church, because it's not normally regular congregants?
No, it's through violence, quite simply. they are going in, and if a man is beating his husband, they will drag him out of the house and they will beat him. But if she might have it coming, according to them, because she's maybe promiscuous or somebody has rumored that she's cheating. So these are moral codes that are coming from the Christian culture, and they're going in and reinforcing this. And if you're challenging the church's authority or you're questioning what's going on, then they're going to come after you. So you have those early churches, right? The 1830s and 1840s. They're ostracizing you and judging you and shunning you. These guys are taking you out and beating you or lynching you. So they're the same things, same charges, but the way they're dealing with them is very different.
And we're talking about Northwest Arkansas, right?
Sure, yeah. So Harrison, 1928, April of 1928, there's this Mason, right? White guy, not black Mason, white Mason. Like, it causes a problem because he's a white guy. He's a prominent member of the community and he's a Mason, but he's been charged with, I don't know, beating his wife or something. They come and take him in the middle of the night and they tell his wife and his daughter they're going to bring him back. He'll be fine. They just want to have a word with him. The KKK does this. They take him off. They find him lynched later on. It's not just black people they're lynching. That's what I think people don't realize is this is across race. This is control and conformity, forced conformity. And they take him off. And so it causes this problem because this guy's a little more prominent in the community. He's a master Mason. There's a lot of things about this. Hold on. We don't do this to our own kind of moment. And so like Harrison's KKK goes a little more underground and they have these hearings and it's published in the newspaper. And like all the guys that they're interrogating and putting on the stand and everything are members of the KKK, but they're like, no, we did this on our own. Has nothing to do with it. They're protecting the institution of the KKK while they know they're probably going to go to prison for life or even be executed for this murder. And yet they're protecting the KKK the same way. So yes, does that answer this is how they deal with this. It's extreme.
Were there churches that were opposed to the Klan speaking out and against it? Do we find record of that?
You do, especially like in that early, when the KKK came into Fayetteville and they were like, yeah, we don't need you kind of thing. The ministers were like, you really shouldn't do this. But then you also have other ministers who were like, this one guy, he gives a sermon. And the title of his sermon, the newspaper publishes this, it says, "What say ye of Christ?" That's the title of his sermon, and he talks about the virtues of Christ. And then at the end of the sermon, he invites everybody to go to the KKK parade and feeding because it's going to be a swell time. And then a week later, they published in the newspaper that like over 600, 700 people showed up to this. And Fayetteville's not a big deal, a massive town like it is now. So this was a big deal.
This sounds like a significantly influential cultural institution.
How much of this do you hear from the pulpits today? How much of this do you hear from people who claim to be Christian? The anti-immigrant status, the ultra-nationalists, women should be a certain way. But it's not just the comment, it's the tone behind it, the anger, the aggression, that like, why is nobody doing something about this? Because I think that's where this gets complicated, is some of this already is there in the Christian rhetoric. It's how you approach it, how you deal with it, or how you address it that becomes more the question, I think, because most Christian faith, I think, point mostly to that love your neighbor and love God, but also like Christ says, if you see a woman who you think is dressed immodestly, it's your sin, not hers, because she's just living her life. You're supposed to gouge out your own eyes for looking at her that way. But we don't talk about it that way necessarily. And so like, at what point did we shift? And you start seeing some of this in this time period. And I don't know that it's all the KKK, but I do think that you see a lot of this rhetoric repeated in a lot of sermons and in a lot of places that are supposed to be the Christian sphere. And you're like, that's not biblical. That's, I've read this before. I wanted to do to my students one time, is this Christian rhetoric or is this the KKK? Just to give them what they did with the Pokemon and the prescription thing that you see on TikTok and stuff. But at what point do you know your scripture, like your own traditions well enough? Or are you just buying into what somebody else is telling you is? And so I think that's where we get into some of this. But yeah, it's a horrible influence.
I think part of this conversation is in my own mind, like I'm trying to understand like the church within the structure of meaning and power, like its own ability to resist, its own ability to accommodate. And it doesn't feel like a real clear line to me, although I think maybe, I want to make sure this is representative historically, but it feels like within our conversation, this is a history of largely accommodation. How do you view that? And I want to make sure that I'm...
Accommodation for who?
Accommodation of the church to cultural, I don't know if power is the right word, but cultural, who's informing who here, I guess is my question. How do we see this historically?
I don't think the church should be powerful. This is me. This is not a historian. This is me. I don't think the church should have power. I think when the power enters the conversation, it corrupts the faith and it corrupts the basic tenets of most people's faith.
You say that as an individual, but that's based off of the history that you've seen. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. Because if you go back to the Crusades, the rhetoric that the West used in the Crusades to justify what was done to the Saracens, the Turks, whoever we thought we were at war with, was used again in the rhetoric after 9/11. You see that same kind of heathen and crusade and infidel, and that's being used on both sides. Like it's on both sides, and that rhetoric still has power today. I think I said that as carefully as I can, but as honestly as I can. So yes, I think we have to be careful, definitely, with it, because church or faith, regardless of what your faith is, I think is how I should say this. Regardless of what your faith is, I think it is very influential to the individual. And I think when we let outside politics and outside authority and outside forces influence that, then we have to question, is this really what my faith is about? Or is this a national movement? Or is this a political movement? Or is this even a philosophical movement and not necessarily about what I actually believe? And so yes, I think those outside influences can be very much corrupting.
Rachel, that story you shared, maybe, and it was a little bit in humor about the picnic. I'm coming back to that really deeply, because what you shared was that the Klan held a picnic and the minister mentioned to his congregation that, hey, here's a lovely opportunity.
He's just validating their existence.
Exactly. And I just think it ties a lot of the conversation we're having around power, who is wielding the power, and then are people making individual decisions that are active, or are they doing what collectively they believe is the best thing to do or the right thing to do at that time to build community and be a good Christian or be a good member of a mosque or be a good member of a mandir or fill in the blank. And I just think that picnic example is so powerful and connects to what you're saying, and I really appreciate that.
And I think it muddies things too, because when you hit that crossroads where you can go either way, maybe you're not completely sure about the decision that you should make in this moment. Oftentimes, we look to the collective for direction or for assistance. And sometimes the group is wrong, but that's not, humans are social creatures by nature. So we do everything as a collective. And there's some of us that don't, but as a general rule, we are a social creature. And so I think that those crossroads, I think that's where it gets interesting. And I think especially whenever you start talking about faith and having that kind of influence, if you get to that crossroads of right and wrong, that we can look back as historians with hindsight and with the whole picture. But you're sitting there and you have this moment where you're like, I don't know they're quoting scripture. Like the church says this is okay. So maybe I'm wrong in what I'm thinking. And so you go that path because the collective or because this authority. In sociology, we talk about power and authority sometimes isn't necessarily about the power itself. It's about the knowledge or the expertise in that. And I think when it comes to right and wrong, most of the time, individuals look to their faith for the answers for right or wrong. And so that puts a lot of pressure on those leaders in those, whatever your faith is, whether it's a temple, whether it's a church, whatever. And I think we forget sometimes those are humans too, just like the rest of us. And that's where it gets messy.
Absolutely. Yeah, that it is an incredibly precarious, powerful, and maybe, I'm not one, so I don't know, but maybe scary position to hold, to be the person who is leading and translating a faith to somebody.
Or you hope they take it that seriously.
Goodness gracious.
You've made me think a lot for the last few weeks, just so you know.
You have returned that to me tenfold. You know, it's interesting because it's not just interesting. I'll just speak this out loud because I think this is part of the question, right? I never know what I'm getting in. Like I'm in way over my head at this point, Monica, but we're just going to keep swimming, I guess, what we're going to do. I come here for two things, right? I come here for the, like, what do we know objectively from the historical record? And then what do we interpret from that, right? And what I hear you doing is yet a third thing, which is, this is how it works itself out in my life too, which is, which I shouldn't be surprised with.
I think history is hard as a discipline to start with. This is one of the things that I've always struggled with as a historian, because I walk to my own beats. Like I do everything separate from a lot of the group. And as historians, we're supposed to be objective. And I think the new school of thought is you can't do that. You're human beings. You can't ever completely step outside of yourself. You're always going to have your own experiences that are going to color how you look at things. But one of the things that I think a lot of the times when we're trying to interpret the historical narrative is people are people. They've always been people. They will always be people. They're always going to be messy and complicated, driven by whatever motivations. And I think for me, sometimes it's different because take the progressive movement, for example, for me has always been that linchpin moment where I realized how weird I was, even as a historian. So we look at the progressive movement a lot of the times as like moving towards labor laws and child labor laws and all of these things. And we look at it as a good thing. I grew up poor. I had a job when I was 10. I got paid under the table for different things. Those labor laws actually were a hindrance to my family surviving. So I think sometimes my perspective looking at things is a little different. And I recognize that, which is helpful that I do recognize that. But sometimes I don't know how different it is till I talk to somebody else and I realize, oh, wow, like I have a very different worldview than what other people do. And I think all historians come to that moment. And you always have your own experiences that are influencing things, but also those judgment calls. And I think that's where I don't know, as historians, maybe that's where the objectivity comes in, as we try not to be as judgmental because we recognize, given that moment, what decision would I make? Like there are some evil people in history, so I'm not going to deny that, but who definitely went out of their way to make really bad choices. But yeah, as a rule, I think that's the hard part.
So as we think through these kind of major change in Northwest Arkansas's history, we move into the 60s and 70s and obviously the emergence of huge new companies that really start to really change the demographics, land use, everything, right? What do we see within faith communities during this kind of coming maybe out of the civil rights era and into our modern day? What do you see within this kind of change?
So you do definitely see that putting a face and a name and a life to that other. You've got these new neighbors that are moving into the area. We have the Hmong move into the area. They're coming from a really horrible experience. They start out in Minnesota and Michigan, and then they start moving into Northwest Arkansas into the 80s. But there is an awareness there is an awareness of what's going on globally. Our newspapers are printing that. So you know what these people are coming from, what they're escaping sometimes, and I think that makes a difference. You also start to see a decline in the 80s and 90s and even into the late 70s of people going to church. The churches that once had paid choir directors and organ players and multiple ministers and a church secretary and maybe a groundskeeper, a whole bunch of different positions and janitors now trying to figure out how they're going to pay for just having a minister or maybe a youth pastor in their congregation. So I think there is a shift to there. Again, I think it's the same that you see after the Civil War. You're still wanting to hold on to that community. And so maybe you start loosening those restrictions on who's welcome, because otherwise we recognize this is going to die. And a lot of churches are dying even today. We have the mega churches, but we also have a lot of churches. The church that I just left not too long ago started out with like 300, 400 people whenever I was in high school. They have 30-something people on a regular Sunday. They're all on a pension. It's not church. The churches have changed. The face of the church has changed very much in that time period. The focus on different things has changed. The First Christian Church in Fayetteville, early on, they're talking about like a singles group and all of these different activities they're going to do for the different people in the congregation. And then the outside influences are happening, and they start talking about, because this is in my lifetime, the 1980s. We get out of Vietnam in 73, and we start talking about the draft is going to be men and women. They start having classes about how to register for the draft and how to counsel women through this process. And there's different things that there's social awareness changes in that time period.
From your view as a human being, your view as a historian, and knowing where we are today in our culture and this conversation, what would you offer to people in Northwest Arkansas as maybe a bit of advice or maybe an encouragement of how to look at our day and age through this lens?
I think advice, I would tell them to read whatever sacred text they believe and stop taking somebody's word for it. But also, people are good inherently, I think. I'm not one of those who think people are inherently bad. And I think that if given the opportunity to see the good, to put a face to whatever it is that they're opposed to, that I think inherently they will make the right decision. I think we are capable of making the right path. I don't think it always has to be the bad path. But yes, I would definitely say read your sacred texts on your own. If you're Christian, read the red letters.
Monica, do you have any other questions? This is what happened to me last time. I just spoke to Rachel. I don't know what to do with all this. Rachel, I don't know how to say thank you, but I am just deeply grateful for the time you've spent, your perspective, and your transparency in your own journey and your own story, and helping all of us try to make sense of this world we're in today, but really trying to learn from all the people that have gone before us about how to make these decisions about what faith and religion and theology and ideology and how it all works itself out in the world. I'm incredibly grateful for your time and for sharing a table with us. And just, I don't know, I'm sure we'll be back. Monica and I will be back with some questions, but just thank you for being a part of this conversation and bringing your wisdom to us.
I appreciate you guys letting me be a part of this, because I think it is a very important conversation, and it's humbling to know that you guys want me to be part of this and voice any of this.
We don't want you to. We need you to. We really do. So
Yeah. Rachel, you just made, I feel like every historian's hope maybe is to bring history alive and make it feel three-dimensional and of the world. And you just I just have so many images and questions and thoughts running through my head and linking things to now and past and present, all because of your wisdom and what you shared. And
Can y'all tell my advisor that?
You can literally share this with them. But we're just humbled and honored to have spent this time with you. And I feel like I could spend 2 weeks with you and still not have enough of your historical knowledge, but also your personal perspective is just so grounding and thoughtful. And I really appreciate also how you really tried to hold a neutral tension in the conversation and really balance the conversation. And I hope that I do that, but you just modeled that so beautifully. And I want to acknowledge that because that is something that I'm always thinking about. How do we do that? Because, seeing the humanity in every human and in every person, and then I am also someone who thinks that we are all inherently good and the world is moving towards goodness. And I believe that. I think the arc of the universe is towards morality, justice, and equity. And I appreciate you sharing your perspectives, sharing your incredible expertise, but just really bringing your incredible heart into this conversation. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you.
I'm sorry I traumatized you, Mike.
You don't traumatize me. You cause me to think about the world in a better way.
It makes
I'm
you
grateful.
feel any better. Angie would walk in for the last couple of weeks and I'd be sitting here going, oh my gosh, Mike is making me think. She goes, in a bad way? And I'm like, no, in a good way. I don't normally have these kinds of moments, but I was like, oh my gosh. And a couple of times I think my hair was standing straight up because I was...
Well, I apologize for that.
No, this was good, but I wanted to do right by it and do justice by this topic because I do think this is important and I do think it has to be done right.
That's right.
Because it is such a divisive topic these days and it talks to so much of what's going on politically in our nation and to our identity, but also internationally with some of the things that are going on. So I applaud you for taking on this topic.
We'll see how it works out.
If it works out.
If it works out, I know. Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you, bud.
Well, we are so very grateful to have Rachel back again this season and for her willingness to not only share what she sees in our historical record, but sharing with us how her own story of faith weaves through all of it. We ended with Rachel's piece of advice. She said, read whatever sacred text you believe and stop taking somebody else's word for it. And then she said, if you're a Christian, read the red letters. I keep coming back to that statement. Is this the difference between faith and theology or the influence of the institution? Could this be the work of discernment? And how is this either represented or not represented in those meanings from the churches that Rachel referenced? I believe this conversation with Rachel is foundational to what we need before sitting down with faith leaders this season. She is giving us a view into the historical record, not as a catalog of events, but as a pattern. And that pattern is not clean. It never was. Rachel has showed us what people who lived inside of it, including herself, have always been trying to figure out where the institution ends and the faith begins. And I will admit, this is the question that I'm also wrestling with, and I'm curious if you are also. I know that we have just scratched the surface, but I think we are ready to enter into these conversations with faith leaders. And as we enter these conversations, we do so knowing that these are the pastors and priests and faith leaders who carry these traditions forward in Northwest Arkansas today. They are the people standing on this ground today, not the ones who created that foundation. However, today their decisions determine how faith and religion, theology, their own institutions, and ideologies are continuing or repairing that history. And that is shaping who we are today and who we are becoming. So thank you again to Rachel and to everyone listening. I want to say thank you. Thank you for being the most important part of what our community is becoming. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.